Who here listens to classical music sometimes? Oh wow. Okay. I mean, you can all go home. We'll just actually we'll hear the quartet. We don't need to. Is there anyone here who thinks classical music is boring? No one? Okay. Good. Irrelevant? Two people. Okay. Good. I'm talking to you. Snobby. Is there anyone here who thinks it's snobby? Okay. A few more people. Good. So look. Snobbery is what most people associate with this genre. So with that in mind, I would like for you to hear something. As Craig said, we are so lucky to have this amazing quartet with us. They're from the Phoenix Symphony. They sound fantastic. I heard them in rehearsal, and I just am so excited for all of us to hear what they have for us. And they're gonna play us a little song. It's a round, so it's like row, row, row your boat, right? It has a melody, and it's layered on top of itself on a delay to create harmonies. We'll let them play, and we'll talk about its significance.
Get closer to your mic.
Oh, I thought my mic was here. Okay. So they're going to play for us, and then we'll talk about it later. Okay, so what do you guys think? Kind of catchy, right? And it's impressive. It's like a musical puzzle. Mozart wrote this voluntarily. No one paid him to write it. He just wrote it for fun. And it's actually supposed to be for voice, for 4 voices. And there are words. Would you like to hear them? I'm going to read them to you anyway. So it's called O du eselhafter Martin, which translates to O you disgusting Martin. Martin is a guy, one of his friends, actually. So the words are, O you disgusting Martin, O you Martinesque donkey, you are as lazy as an old horse without a head or feet. I can't even start with you. I'll see you hang in the gallows, you stupid old horse, you stupid... Yeah. You stupid Martin, it gets even more typical Mozart. You're as lazy as an old horse. Oh, dear friend, I beg you. I should have thought about what this would feel like to read out loud. Okay. Oh, this is just what he wrote. These are not my words. So, oh, lick me right away in the ass. Oh, lick, oh, won't you lick me right away in the ass. So that is, thank you. He also wrote a version for someone named Pyle, which he just changed the word Martin to Pyle and dedicated it to someone else. So this is not nearly the most dirty or explicit canon that Mozart wrote. It's just the only one that I thought I could read out loud. He also wrote one called Lick mich im Arsch, so lick me in the ass. He wrote another one called Leck mir den Arsch fein, recht schön sauber, which is So specific, someone speaks German. Lick my ass finally beautifully clean for me. So you see there's a theme emerging here. You understand what he likes and what he does with his free time. And also throughout his, sorry. Yeah. So in his letters, we can do some questions after. I do like the give and take though. In his letters, he also has some of the most creative and detailed examples of scatology that I've come across. I mean, not that I spend so much time reading this kind of thing, but really impressive descriptions of his bowel movements, poems. He sometimes like personifies his excrement. It's really, if you're interested, you should check them out. Anyway, so while there is some snobbery in the industry, and I am the first to admit this, Mozart definitely does not fit into the snob box. In fact, if we consider why snobbery is linked to the industry, it has very little to do with the music or with anyone who was writing it. So you think back to the time of Mozart, Bach, there were no streaming services, there was no Kickstarter. It was very hard for artists to monetize their music. And there were concert halls, but it wasn't enough to live off of to sell tickets. So they needed employment. And the only people who could afford to employ them were members of the aristocracy. Snobs, in other words. And Hollywood really, the system of patronage continued. We still, musicians, musical organizations, they can't survive without donations. And there's nothing, I'm not saying that all rich people are snobs. There are poor snobs, there are rich not snobs. But to generalize, I think one of the reasons that a lot of people feel uncomfortable getting into this art form, going to concerts, is because they feel like they're going to be left out and they won't fit in. And part of that is also Hollywood. Hollywood has really picked up on this. It's gotten better in the last decade or so, but I feel like in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, every time you heard a piece of classical music, almost, it was like to make you feel uncomfortable. It's when there's a protagonist in a setting where they don't really belong. You have Julia Roberts with Richard Gere in Pretty Woman, the scene with the snails, they're playing Vivaldi, and there's Ferris Bueller's Day Off, when they go and they pretend to be rich and they go to that stuffy restaurant in Chicago. There's some Boccherini playing, and it's like this over and over again. It's usually the same 3 pieces of classical music too. Anyway, so yes, there is some snobbery that you kind of have to get through, but Mozart actually hated this system of patronage. And not only was he not really a snob, but he also had a really poor relationship with one of his employers, the Prince Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo. He wrote all the time about how much he hated this guy, how stingy he was. He never let Mozart do the projects that he wanted to do in other cities. So Mozart kept trying to get fired because back then you couldn't quit. In fact, Bach tried to quit he also was employed by some nobleman or other, and he tried to quit because he was passed over for a promotion. And in response to his giving notice, his employer put him in jail for 4 weeks. So they were really, this wasn't a system that worked for them. It's not really their target group that they were composing for. They just needed money, and these were the people who could give them that money. So for me, classical music has some of the most exciting, relevant, beautiful music that exists. I guess a lot of you feel the same way. And Craig Biddle, in his opening speech, he talked about intentionality, discovering what you like, and it's just, it's so important for people not to give in to their preconceptions about this music, to do their due diligence, because it's really worth getting through some of the poop, since this is about pretense and poop, that is in the industry. And there is a lot. It's like, I feel like it's kind of like Paris, It's this beautiful city, gorgeous architecture, but sometimes you're so worried about the dog shit everywhere that you can't even look up to enjoy the buildings around you. It's like that, I think, for people getting into the industry. You know, they're worried they're going to step in something. They're going to reveal themselves to be sort of unequal to the task of listening. But in fact, this music is really it's just an expression of humanity, and that's sort of what we're going to focus on today. So yeah, there is the literal crap in the industry, like Mozart's letters. You can avoid them or seek them out, whatever you prefer. But there are also these this metaphorical, so these associations, the baggage. And snobbery is one, we'll come back to it. But there's also this idea that classical music is a monolith, that it's one thing. So when most people think of classical music, they think of this, of course. Classical music isn't a real thing. That's actually the first chapter in my book. It's, you know, what Martin, the song Martin, reminds us of is the fact that what we call classical music is just hundreds of years of all kinds of different music it's just lumped together into one hodgepodge of a genre. So it was the only form of written music for centuries, encompassing everything from like funeral marches, dance music, there's background music, there's concert music, of course, ceremonial music. It's everything, and you can't really put it together. Some of it is good, some of it is bad, of course. I mean, some of it is good for some people, some of it is bad for others. My parents, I have to remember that this is here. My parents love medieval music. It's some of their favorite. And I personally, I can't say it about all medieval music, but most of it, it just depresses me so much. I can't listen to it. So when they turn it on, I just leave the room immediately because I can't be around it. And that's, you know, people are free to have their preferences that way. Speaking of medieval music, one of the things that we do, we who study this music, we break up this genre into 7 compositional periods. So it's by time period. It starts with medieval, then there's the Renaissance period, Baroque, classical, romantic, 20th century, and contemporary. And these are really helpful because most of them center around common stylistic movements and aesthetics. So if you like Mozart, he's a classical composer from the classical period. We'll get into more of what that is later. But then you're very likely to enjoy the music of his contemporaries, because they were all sort of course, there's variety. I mean, Martin, the song, is also different than some of Mozart's operas, but it's sort of a common aesthetic and sensibility, I guess. So I thought that because we have this amazing quartet with us, it would be fun for them to give us a tour, an overview of the entire classical genre. They'll play one excerpt from each period, and we're going to try to listen for the differences between them and sort of the evolution of these sounds. And keep in mind that this is also only the difference that can be achieved with one ensemble. So when you bring in operas and piano music and symphonies, it becomes even greater. But I think we'll be able to see a lot here. So the first period is medieval. I will try not to become so depressed while listening that I can't continue with the talk. So it starts in 500 AD and it goes all the way to 1400 AD, approximately. We want to think of the times, the emphasis on religion, the lack of scientific knowledge, and the sort of general darkness. You'll hear that it's pretty amorphous, relatively, and the harmonies and scales that you'll hear, they're predecessors of the scales we use now. So it's close to the harmonies. It's still, your ears will recognize them as harmonies and as scales, but it's like a prototype. So this is a bit of Guillaume de Machaut's Messe de Notre Dame. So now we come to the Renaissance period, which was approximately 1400 to 1600. And you will hear the change in sort of the mentality here and the approach to music. For me, it's like the sun coming out after centuries of darkness. And you'll hear also that the structure is building, the tonality is getting closer to so the harmonies, the scales are getting closer to what we associate normally with the core of classical music and what is used mostly in pop music today as well. So this is Thomas Tallis, If Ye Love Me. Okay, good. So next we come to the Baroque period, which is about 1600 to 1750. We're getting now to the heart of what most people, when they think of classical music, this is what they think of, and the next few periods as well. This is where, I mean, you guys are all experts, but most people would recognize names as well here. So Bach, Vivaldi, Handel, Corelli, these are all from the Baroque period. And there's even more structure, rhythmic and harmonic structure. So this is Corelli's Concerto Grosso Opus 6, number 8, entitled Christmas, because if Phoenix in the summer makes us think of anything, it's Christmas. So now we come to the classical period. So that's 1750 to about 1830. It is confusing that there is a classical period within the classical genre, but this one is to do with classicism, the movement, so linked to the art and architecture of the time as well. It is generally more fluid and lilting. There's still plenty of rules and conventions though, and of course, composers who come from this period, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, kind of. We'll talk about why kind of later. So this is Haydn's Opus 33, number 2, a bit of the first movement. They're amazing, right? Anyway. So now we get to the Romantic period. This is around 1820. There's overlap with the classical period, and the early 20th century. It goes through the beginning of the 20th. And this was really all about emotion and expressivity. There was a throughout this period, this gradual unraveling of the structure. So it's like everything that's buttoned up about the previous two periods sort of comes undone here, and it's more bigger ensembles. I mean, this time we're going to stick with the quartet, but in general, the orchestras got bigger, more luscious harmonies, more contrast. Some of the most famous composers from this era would be Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Chopin, Puccini. And this is Mendelssohn. This is a little early in the Romantic period, but there's still, you'll be able to hear the difference, but there's still some of that structure from the classical. So this is Mendelssohn's Quartet, Opus 44, number 2. everyone in this room, including myself, hates me for chopping up these pieces into these small segments. I just want to listen to them play the whole night. Well, at the end, they'll get to play something whole, but you'll have to deal with me until then. So now we get to the 20th century. This is the first period that is not unified by an artistic principle. It's really just a ton of styles and movements. It's impossible to generalize about, but there was this general sort of trend away from the harmonies and the sounds, the tonalities that are common in the other periods. So experimentation was key. People are just really breaking away and testing the limits. So some of the composers from this period are Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Samuel Barber, Philip Glass. I've chosen a sort of in-the-middle example from the standard rep so that we have this thread of evolution. This is Bartók's String Quartet number 4. But there was also much more experimental music from this period, too. An example that springs to mind is John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Actually, so they haven't rehearsed this, but I wonder, since I think they know it, if they can play a bit. Maybe like 20 seconds? Okay. Okay, I think that's enough. Thank you. I feel like you guys are too smart. I can't trick you. But this is the piece. It's 4 minutes and 32 seconds of musician, usually it's a pianist, sitting, and the music is the reaction. And so it's conceptual. Anyway, we're getting to the contemporary period now, which is just as all over the place as the 20th century. Yeah, 20th century, because there's no real, the only thing that changes it is just that it's not the 20th century anymore. So contemporary is really composers who are still alive. And so again, hard to generalize, but what I have noticed is that what a lot of people, not just I, have noticed, there is this return to tonality. Well, not universal, but I feel like composers are experimenting now more with incorporating tonality back into their music. So it's less, like people are less allergic to it than they were at the end of the 21st century. And 20th century. I'm getting my centuries confused. I'm jet lagged. And here we're gonna do, this is Scott Wheeler's, it's from his Water Scenes Quartet. And he uses this technique to sort of mimic the sounds we associate with the water. This is a movement entitled Shorebirds, so we'll just hear a bit of that. Okay, so now we're through all 7 periods, and there's a pretty big range, as you already know, encompassed in the whole of this repertoire. And this is, again, only what we could sort of see with the string quartet, with one ensemble. So now I want to share some other examples, some more specific examples and stories from the core, really like the heart of the repertoire, as most people see it. So first, I chose a piece that's actually inextricably linked to snobbery, and it's very apropos because of King Charles. So it's a coronation anthem by Handel. It was written for the coronation of King George II, and it's been played at the coronation of every British monarch since. It does not get more snobby than this, but I have a story for you. So my husband is a German lawyer, and before he is either of those things, or my husband, he's a football fan. And by football, I mean soccer. So when we lived in Berlin, he used to watch football in this bar called Pretense. It's really the most disgusting place I've ever been to. The walls were totally grimy, like the windows were covered up with Bayern Munich flags. There were all of these like mini alcohol, like mini bar bottles everywhere, and I never knew whether they were part of the decor or whether no one had cleaned them up. But anyway, the point is, it was really just super gross place. And I was so shocked one time when we went. I went with him a few times because that is how much I love him. And we sat down, the projector went on, and suddenly I was hearing this Handel coronation anthem out of nowhere. I was really surprised. And it didn't seem to be bothering any of the other football fans there. In fact, they seemed to be really moved by it. Some of them were crying. And what I found out is that UEFA, so the Union of European Football Associations, selected this coronation anthem by Handel, called Zadok the Priest, as their Champions League anthem. The Champions League is like their, do we have football fans here? Soccer? Okay, yeah. So you know that the Champions League it's like the highest league where the champions of the smaller leagues, the national leagues from the previous season, they get to compete in this sort of like super trophy tournament. And this is what they chose. They could have chosen any song from any time, We Are the Champions for one, but they chose this coronation anthem because it is so effective at kind of inspiring this sense of submission to something greater than you, the sense of loyalty, and it really, even thinking about it, I get goosebumps. You will get them when you hear this quartet played. And it is also proof that even a piece that was intended for the snobbiest of snobs can appeal, can really move all kinds of people, even people who went to that bar. So this is Zadok the Priest. So now the next piece, I have to give Mozart a chance to redeem himself after this Martin song that we did with him. We've covered that he was funny and that he was a bit unusual in his taste. And he was also unusual in the fact that he was a complete genius. I mean, it's inarguable. He used to write whole sonatas in his head in like an hour. It was crazy. However, he was also a pretty normal guy in a lot of ways. He was close with his family, very affectionate with them. We know he pooped. And I want to read you one of his letters because, so I came across this when I was writing my book and I couldn't use it. I don't know that it's been translated before, but it's not one of his most eloquent or passionate letters, but it just is so, I don't know, it's so normal. It feels like the kind of letter you could get from an angry spouse or partner today. This was a letter he wrote to Constanza, his then fiancée. It was a sort of like standard lovers tiff thing. There was some mansplaining. They'd been at the modiste, at the tailor, and Mozart had taken it upon himself to educate Constanza about fashion, and she had not appreciated it. So she broke up with him, and this is the letter that he wrote to her, part of it. Dearest best friend, I suppose you will still allow me to call you this. I assume you won't hate me so much that I'm no longer allowed to be your friend anymore, and you no longer my friend. And should you no longer wish to be, you still can't forbid me from thinking well of you, my friend, as I've become so accustomed to doing. Consider what you've said to me today. You have, ignoring all of my pleas, given me the boot 3 times and said right to my face that you no longer want to have anything to do with me. But I, for whom it is not so insignificant as it is for you to lose an object of affection, am not so hot-headed, unreflective, and irrational as to accept said boot. For this, I love you too much. And then he defends his position from earlier. He really backpedals and doesn't do himself any favors, but he reiterates how much he loves her at the end, and I guess it worked because they got married. Anyway, this piece, it really shows his genius, but I think it also shows a lot of this personality, so some of the brooding, but also this impishness, right? This lightness and levity that he has. So this is Mozart's String Quartet number 19, entitled Dissonance. So next I want to talk about Robert and Clara Schumann, because they're from the Romantic period, and they really embodied Romanticism in practically every sense of the term. We're going to listen to a piece by Robert Schumann, but he's considered one of the greatest composers of all time. In Germany, he's like a god. Clara is also a wonderful composer, but she was primarily a performer during her life, so her output is just smaller, and she did not write any quartets. So we won't be hearing from her tonight, but we'll hear about her, because they had this amazing forbidden love throughout the early part of their courtship. So they met when Robert was a student of Clara's father. Clara was a wunderkind. She was a child prodigy, and she was performing all around Europe for kings and queens already when she was 11. And Robert was much older, so this was before there was any romantic involvement. But he heard Clara playing, and he realized he had wanted to be a pianist, but he realized he was never going to be as good as she was. So he quit, and he became one of the greatest composers ever instead. And when Clara turned 16, they shared a kiss. And Clara's father got really upset. I don't know if he knew about the kiss, but he understood that something was happening. And he thought that Robert was just good for nothing. He said his music was mediocre and impossible to play, even though Clara had no problem playing it. And he took her away, Clara, on a tour for 2 years. He removed all the inkwells from her room so that she couldn't, everywhere they went, so she couldn't write to Robert. And there was amazing, it's like right out of a movie, when she came back to Leipzig, where they all lived, to play a concert at the Gewandhaus, which is the big concert hall there. She had no way of communicating with Robert, so she programmed 4 of his pieces as her encore, and that was like a signal to him that she still loved him. And this led immediately to Robert proposing to her, which then led immediately to Clara's father separating them again. So then they entered into this legal battle with her father, because she was 18, and the age of majority in Germany at the time was 21. So then they stayed together in this long-distance separated situation. They sued the dad for permission, and eventually they did get permission. They wed one day before Clara's 21st birthday, when they would have been allowed to marry anyway, but good for them for sticking it to him for those 24 hours. And anyway, so it's just, there was also later, there was this whole love triangle with Brahms. I don't know if you guys know about it. We don't have time to get into it, but it's just a lot of romance there. And then they also embodied Romanticism in a darker way. So Robert Schumann, he mentally and emotionally, he struggled. He developed a fear of metal. He had these angelic and demonic visions. There's several suicide attempts, and eventually he was afraid he would hurt someone, Clara, one of the kids, and so he voluntarily checked himself into an asylum, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. And Clara supported their family with her concerts. She had gone back to performing even before. And they were separated again for the end, for all the last years. So it's really, again, the Romantic period is about, yes, it's about love and this kind of expressivity, but it's also about this sort of Sturmdrang. It's this really intense, like, German darkness. And they have all of that. But this piece that we're going to hear, this was, Schumann wrote it just 2 years after he and Clara were finally allowed to marry. And it's between the births of their first and second children. So it was before he had struggled as much, but we'll hear the quartet number 3. So one of my favorite composers of all time is Shostakovich. His music is so impactful. He was Russian. He had a very complicated, turbulent relationship with the country and its government. His music was powerful. It elicited a very powerful response from his audiences, and that made it a threat, and it made him a threat. And also it was a threat because in his music, he often gave voice, he advocated for the oppressed and the persecuted. And sometimes he was critical of the government and the country and its past. So his premieres were sometimes targeted, his reputation was often smeared. He went through periods where his family was threatened. But he insisted on continuing. He said once, "Even if they cut off both my hands and I have to hold my pen in my teeth, I will keep writing music." So he was very brave, but he was also scared. With good reason. His brother-in-law, his mother-in-law, many of his friends had been imprisoned or killed. And eventually he capitulated and he joined the Communist Party. He hated himself for it. His thoughts turned suicidal, and it was during this period of self-hatred that he wrote this quartet, the 8th quartet that we're going to hear. There is ample proof that he meant for it to be his last. He dedicated the work to the victims of fascism and war, and it's not an empty dedication. You'll hear, we're going to go through some examples and talk through them, and you'll hear the story is unmistakable. So it opens, and this is one small piece of evidence that it was sort of a suicide note. It begins with his initials, the notes D, E flat, C, B. Do you think, Morgan, can you just play just the first 4 notes? So this is in the German notation, it's D-S-C-H, so D for Dmitri, and then S-C-H, S-C-H for the German spelling of Shostakovich. And this is used in his music, but in this piece in particular. So the whole opening, you'll hear it, and it comes back throughout the piece in different incarnations. So we'll just listen to a bit of the first movement, and then we'll go to the next excerpt. So now we'll jump to the second movement. So the piece is in 5 movement segments, and the second is completely different. You will hear that the initials come back in it in the middle of what we're going to hear. Totally different. And at the end of it, there's this really important Jewish theme that you also hear in his piano trio number 2. He was very passionate about Jewish folk music and very vocal against the anti-Semitism that some of his countrymen were displaying, and also, of course, the recent history of persecution of Jewish people. So this is from the second movement. So the next movement, we're going to hear a bit of it. This is one of the most chilling moments in music. It's this eerie, sarcastic waltz. Some people describe it as the waltzing of skeletons. Other people have said and believe that it is Jewish prisoners who were forced to dance on their graves before their execution. And you could also hear it. Shostakovich himself felt like he was made to dance by the Communist Party for much of his life, and if we read this as a suicide note, this is also an interpretation that we could apply. So the last excerpt that we're going to hear from this piece is another one of the most chilling moments in music. You're going to hear, it's very short, just the droning of wartime planes and then the sound of the KGB knocking at the door, which was a sound that Shostakovich dreaded for most of his life. Terrifying. I mean, that was adorable, but it's terrifying. The music is terrifying, and Shostakovich did not kill himself after writing this. He went on to write many powerful, very important works, but this music of his, it really shows us how vivid the classical genre can be, how different it is from the classical period and the Romantic period and earlier periods as well. I mean, no one can say that this is boring, right? So now you will be free of me very soon, but we have to listen to something by Beethoven before we go. And we have to let them play something where I don't interfere in the middle. Beethoven's possibly the most iconic classical composer. It's either Beethoven or Mozart, probably. And he also is my favorite composer, and he defies so many classical stereotypes. First, he was a total anti-snob. He believed fiercely in the ideals of the French Revolution, so the liberty, democracy, fraternity. He even dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon right after the revolution. He saw Napoleon as this leader of the people, this people's person, leader, and it was about to go through with the premiere, and then Napoleon declared himself emperor. And Beethoven became so furious, he ripped out the dedication page from the score, and you can actually see in surviving copies, because everything had to be copied up by hand back then, that they had to cut the dedication out of the title page. And then he instead dedicated it to the soldiers in general. He also there are many examples of how he didn't set much store by aristocracy, money. He had this pupil, the Archduke Rudolph. He kept trying to get rid of him, but he couldn't because he needed the money. And the guy was really powerful, but he was always complaining about him. And there was a story about how Archduke Rudolph once made Beethoven wait in his anteroom because he wasn't ready for their lesson. He had something to do, and Beethoven did not like this. So during the lesson, he was super impatient with him. He was like rapping him on the knuckles and screaming at him, and the Archduke asked, "Why are you being like this?" And Beethoven said, "I wasted so much time waiting in your anteroom that I don't have any time to be patient now." So he didn't respect the title. There was also, I think, one of my favorite letters that he wrote. This was he had one of his brothers owned land, and again, Beethoven was not impressed by the money factor, the land owning factor. And his brother wrote this letter to Beethoven saying, he signed it, landowner after his name. And Beethoven wrote back, and he signed the letter brain owner. So he valued this much more than money or titles. But perhaps most importantly, Beethoven, he was so human, as all the composers were, but there's so much humanity that's captured in his music, humanity that's captured in his music. It can never be irrelevant, and you can never put it on a pedestal, because we share too much with it. It's too relatable. Everyone knows that he was deaf, but I feel like some people think that it's a sign that he was superhuman. But we know, from his letters, from his Heiligenstadt Testament, which is a letter he wrote to his brothers 25 years before his death. He was already experiencing this deafness, and he was ill a lot of the time. And he wrote to them that he was scared, that he felt lonely, and that he would consider ending his life if it weren't for music. And you just have to imagine, what it must have felt like for this man, this person. Everyone in his circle, everyone who knew him, who admired him, everyone he worked with, what united them was hearing. It was their sense of hearing. And for him, it was slipping away for most of his life. And at the very end, he barely had any at all. There's nothing more human than feeling lonely, I think, and wanting to reach out in the way that Beethoven did with so much of his music, with his Ode to Joy in the Ninth, and so many of his ideals of brotherhood. So this last piece, we're going to hear the cavatina from his Opus 130 quartet, and he wrote it a year before he died. He was very sick. His hearing was all but gone, and sections of the piece capture this kind of disorientation, but mostly there is this tremendous warmth and gratitude and tenderness, and that's really, we think of him as this cranky guy and this bad-tempered guy, and a lot of that had to do with his illness and his deafness and feeling lonely and frustrated that people couldn't hear him. But this is what he was putting out towards the end of his life, this and his Ninth, these joyful pieces, these really beautiful human pieces. So let's think of all of that while we listen to this cavatina. So we're done. We can do questions now. The musicians have also said they will answer questions if you have them also. And afterwards, I have my book out there in case anyone wants to buy it. Do you have is there a mic?
Yeah. I mean, thanks for everything, and thank you to all the performers. All of you were incredible and worked very well together. So I wanted to ask, when we're considering so when we're considering classical music, I notice a lot of the themes come up, say, for example, in video game OSTs. Composers like Solkin, who is instrumental in Final Fantasy 16 and 14, huge fan of him. So what are some of your favorite composers who incorporate classic motifs in visual art forms or interactive art forms?
Okay, so my kids are 5 and 2, so we haven't gotten to all the video games yet. We're still with like Super Mario and with the older one. But so in terms of film music, I think I'm such a fan of film scores in general, like Korngold, like from back, he wrote so The Adventures of Robin Hood, I think, has one of the best film scores of all time. And then more recently, I would say, like, certainly, I love John Williams. I love all of these, oh God, guys, I need help. I'm just forgetting names. Harry Potter, John Williams, but, yeah. Okay, yeah, this is for me, this is amazing. But there are more, it's sort of a separate, like, I haven't done as much. When I hear it, I really appreciate it. It's just something I haven't taken the time to study as much. I really also like Ego Plum from the Cuphead show. Do you know? It's really funny, but it's more jazz, I would say. He uses more jazz with other sort of honky-tonk forms of music. Anyway, so I am sorry I can't satisfactorily answer all of that, but I would definitely say that John Williams is a favorite. And it's not Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but there's, like, obviously not that, but there's someone whose name is like that, and that's the name that's coming to me now because of the time change with Germany. Anyway, if I think of it later, I'll find you.
Thank you. So I really appreciated the format you gave to the talk, where you walked us through this whole era and how you described the era beforehand. And that makes me think, just 100, 300 years into the future, how would someone look back into the current era we're at? So I wanted to pick your brain, because I believe streaming platforms have radically changed the music scene for us. And they have created this noise where there's a whole bunch of things going on, not only classical music, where you could focus on a movement before specifically on a specific movement for a specific era. Nowadays you've got a lot of movements going on, a lot of genres going on. So I was just wondering, if you were a just professor 300 years in the future, how you would describe this era and what has motivated art in this era, and who would you say has been the most influential artist, if you were thinking 300 years into the future nowadays?
It's a really good question, and it's also a difficult one, because we're very lucky when we're looking back at the sort of common practice period. So the Baroque, classical, romantic time has really filtered out a lot of composers. So we're left with what survived, and then it's easy to say, Beethoven, Mozart, these were the greatest composers. Maybe, we know we've lost some really good composers. We've lost sight of people who haven't been given their sort of dues. But now, there are some contemporary composers that I think we can say for sure will be remembered, especially, actually this would have been a good, red violin films, or Corigliano, John Corigliano. I don't know if he's still here, but this is another, he writes film scores as well, and also, so I think for sure, Corigliano, John Adams. I really like Caroline, again, right, sorry, it's like the middle of the night, Caroline Shaw, thank you. It's in my book, I just can't recall the names right now. These are people who I think for sure have a place, and then time will tell. It's just hard to know. As you say, streaming platforms do change everything. Social media changes everything. So I think for a lot of people, it will depend on on their visibility and how they're able to cut through the noise. And I'm not sure, I suppose it was always that way in a sense, but now I feel that it's even more cluttered. So I think it will be difficult. But in terms of how people will look back on the time as a whole, it will probably be as difficult as it is for us now to describe the 20th century music. There's just a lot going on, except I know very few, I don't know, maybe you guys are more aware, but I know very few sort of mainstream classical composers who are composing purely in tonal mediums. Yeah.
Like
John.
Ludovico Einaudi.
Sorry?
For example, Ludovico Einaudi, he's like a neoclassical composer
Okay.
who I think might go down in history as one of those like classical
Yeah. There's also, I was recently, there was this sort of tangent, but recently the grandkids of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and Carlo Menotti got married, and Giancarlo Menotti, sorry. And Giancarlo Menotti is an example of one of these composers who probably wasn't given as much attention because he was composing in this sort of romantic style, which wasn't considered serious enough in the 20th century. But I think maybe in the future, he would be someone people would respect more in hindsight, because when you separate it from how he compared to the other people of the time, then I think it becomes a different narrative. But I'm not a fortune teller, but it's a really interesting mental exercise for sure. Yeah.
Hi, so first of all, I want to say beautiful performances by everyone. And I'd like to say that I am a classically trained classical pianist and composer, and I have literally lived through the Fountainhead. And basically there's this music is so uplifting and enriching and romantic, and yet the classical music education is really limiting, and it stifles creativity. And that's kind of what I've noticed across the board in every conservatory, in the culture, in the industry, everywhere. So what I want to ask you is, for the future of classical music, what do you think needs to be done to the industry or the education to change things and to actually make people see how beautiful this music really is? Because if nothing changes, people will lose interest in it.
So this is sort of like a two-part thing. First of all, I fully know what you mean about the education. Are you talking more about classical education for young people who aren't pursuing music, or who are pursuing music?
For those who are.
Who are.
Yeah.
So this is actually, it's one of the themes that's in my book as well. There's sort of, like, the book focuses, there's a memoir narrative arc, but then there are lessons in classical music in between. And for me, I mean, the reason I am also not here playing, I'm glad I'm not, because they sound so good together and I would have ruined it, but is partly because of this. I had a really hard time balancing professionalism and this sort of seeking perfection in my technique with my love of music. And it just, at a certain point, became almost incompatible, because you're right, it is stifling. And I do think that there needs to be a different approach. It's difficult because it's so ingrained, these international competitions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with these, but it's just the standards are so high, and if you can't meet the technical standards, then it's not enough that you have something to say, you really. So I don't really know what the solution is, but I agree something has to probably change in order for there to be this sort of like whole musician person combination. I would also love to hear from you guys here if you have any thoughts. And then in terms of what needs to happen for the industry to survive, for the genre to survive, I think there is already a lot that's happening that people are doing, artists and organizations. They're starting, there's always this delay, right? So you notice that the audiences are dwindling, and then you realize too late you need to do something. And I think I do have hope because I think that there is so much more diversity and innovation in the upcoming generations of soloists and performers. And there are more formats like this, like lecture recitals, things that aren't strict, like you have to sit in your seat for 2 solid hours and it's uncomfortable. But do you guys have any thoughts? Because you're also in a position to, do you want to, yeah, come. Is this?
There it is. It's a couple things. You have to find yourself a really good teacher, because that's how you're going to learn. And they exist. They're not everywhere. And the second part is you. You find yourself a good teacher, you learn everything you can, you soak it up, and then you create, and then you take yourself to the public. You go out, you perform, you show, and I don't want to say you have to do it aggressively, but like a little bit. You have to be like, hey guys, this is what's really cool. This is what I think is really, really cool, or what I think is really, really beautiful, and that's what's going to sustain it. As classical musicians who play professionally in an orchestra, we worry about our audience in the future. There's not a lot of young people. People say, oh, the audience is mostly blue hair, right? It's mostly older people, and we love them. We're so grateful for them, of course. But we need younger people, so it's you. Look for teachers, and you don't have to like stay with the same one if they're not the best for you. We've all jumped around to numerous people before. So, I know, that's my 2 cents on it.
Sorry.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, when Mozart was writing these extremely personal songs at people, how did he make sure that they heard it? Did he show up at their door with a quartet, or did he play it all around town, or what?
That is an excellent question. I know sometimes it was something he did at parties. You know, he wrote it and he would take it out, and it would be like with their circle of friends, and he would start playing this, or as a little gift for them for their birthday, maybe. I don't know. I don't know whether he ever performed them publicly. I would imagine not, but you never know. I mean, his operas are also filled with all kinds of innuendos and kind of risque humor, so it's possible. I don't know if you, I know, I think for this one, I read something, or for one of them, I read that it was like he had a circle of friends, and they met, and they would do things like this. It was one of their fun activities, because there is no, no video games, so.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much. You've been such a good audience.